Well, hello everyone. Welcome to Resistance Live. I'm going to move my chair for, what's today? The 26th of June, 2025. Okay. There is so much going on right now in the context of the federal courts that it's kind of hard to keep up. But what we have to talk about today is this enormous scandal that has broken concerning the DOJ in the last 24 hours. It is like appalling is too kind a word. And personally, I'm just outraged as a lawyer, having a moment of like, holy crap, just about the allegations themselves. And, very concerned, frankly, about what this all means for the rule of law going forward. So we're going to talk about all of that today, in addition to some questions about the case concerning the mobilization of the California National Guard in California and a Supreme Court ruling this morning concerning Planned Parenthood, which sucks. And then, of course, we still have to deal with Iran and Pete Hegseth and everything else. Okay, so all that's coming up. I'm Elizabeth Cronise McLaughlin. I was a Wall Street lawyer for 15 years, as many of you know. For the last 15 or so years, I've been running a company that's dedicated to leadership and activism and mobilization training. So you all know me, I think, at this point, but it's good for the new folks to know who I am. Okay, today for our visually challenged viewers, I'm wearing a blue sweater that has a piece of fuzz on the front of it. And my hair is down. I'm a pink-skinned, green-eyed, dirty, blonde-haired woman, and I'm sitting, as always, in front of my bookshelf and my yellow utility cart here in my office, and I'm coming to you from occupied Muncie, Lenape, and Mohican land. Okay, so Emil Bove, as we have discussed a lot this week, is in the middle of his confirmation hearings to potentially get a lifetime appointment to the Third Circuit Federal Court of Appeals. There are more lawyers than I can count that are wildly opposed to this for reasons having to do with the little that we knew about Emil Bove and his role in the Eric Adams scandal, the current mayor of New York City, and the corruption case against him being dismissed by Trump's DOJ in exchange for him allowing access to ICE in New York City residences. And that was something that caused something like a dozen members of the lawyers inside the DOJ to quit when Emil Bove ordered them to dismiss the case. That in and of itself was a huge scandal. But what happened yesterday was that a whistleblower, a fellow who had already been kind of known to the public because he is the lawyer who admitted in federal court on behalf of the DOJ that Kilmar Abrego Garcia had been wrongfully sent to CCOT. He was fired for that statement, by the way. What we learned from him, because he is now a whistleblower, is that Emil Bove essentially ordered the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security to ignore court orders concerning immigration law and people who had been unlawfully detained, and did so by essentially in a group meeting inside the Department of Justice, telling Justice Department officials and lawyers that their response to any order that sought to stop Trump's wildly illegal immigration efforts was to say, fuck you to the courts. Pardon my French, but that's the exact language that was used. And apparently that meeting made a lot of people uncomfortable. It made this particular whistleblower very uncomfortable, in part because part of his job was to be on the court hearings concerning immigration proceedings and then advise the lawyers up the chain at the Department of Justice and at the Department of Homeland Security about what they had to do. So the place where this starts to get very, very evil is that Judge Boseberg, we all know, Chief Judge of the DC District Court, had the case in front of him concerning the deportations to CCOT. And you all will remember that when the planes were in the air, he ordered those planes turned around. Apparently, in the middle of that hearing, this whistleblower attorney did his job and advised other lawyers inside the Department of Justice and inside DHS that the planes should not be allowed to land, that they had to be turned around. And that was overridden by Emil Bove, who told them that it was okay for the planes to land in CCOT and for the planes to be deplaned. And we all know where that has ended. We now have more than 230 plus men who are in a concentration camp in El Salvador, despite Judge Boseberg's order to turn the planes around. And it gets worse because apparently the meeting in which Judge Bove, not Judge Bove, for hopefully he'll never be Judge Bove, in which Emil Bove advised these DOJ officials to do the FU to the courts. Another lawyer was there by the name of Ensign. And Ensign is the lawyer who, in the proceedings in front of Judge Boseberg, advised the judge that he had no information on whether or not planes were going to take off to CCOT that weekend. You'll all remember that when this happened, it was like a Saturday night, okay? That, my friends, turns out to have been a lie. Because the meeting in which Bove said F you to the courts if they tried to stop this, he also told all the staff in that meeting that Trump was about to invoke the Alien Enemies Act, which has since been stopped, and that the planes were going to be taking off to El Salvador that weekend. So he literally, in a court hearing, lied to the judge. And I'm going to tell you that's a disbarable offense in kind of like any jurisdiction that I've ever been a part of. You cannot lie to the court. You're literally risking your bar license when you do that. And this particular lawyer, Ensign, lied to Judge Boseberg. He knew that the planes were in the air. He knew planes were departing. And he told the judge he had no information on it. Then on top of that, the planes took off. And Bove then overrode the ruling of the judge and told the DHS that the planes could land and the men on those planes could be deplaned and left in El Salvador. So all of this is I don't know. You know, I've had a law degree now for almost 30 years, a law license now for almost 30 years. I have never heard of this kind of overt, intentional defiance of a court order, let alone by some of the most senior officials inside the Department of Justice. I mean, it is, and you know, this is the reason why the thumbnail says what it says today. This is something that in any other administration would have taken down the entire senior leadership of the DOJ. The Attorney General, the Deputy Attorney General, anybody in charge of the decision-making related to this, and any lawyers that carried it out would be done. But here, in this instance, we don't have anybody to enforce it. The best we can hope for here is that this scandal itself stops Emil Bove from ascending to a lifetime judicial appointment on the Third Circuit Court of Appeals because he has violated his code of ethics and he shouldn't have a bar license any longer. All of this at this point is something that needs an enormous amount of discussion in the public domain. And, you know, Asha Rangappa, who you all know at Yale Law School, has pointed out that this is worse than what we already knew about Emil Bove with regard to the Eric Adams case. And George Conway said yesterday, and I repeated this morning, I have never in my entire legal career, the entire time I was a licensed practicing lawyer and since, because I still have my bar licenses, have I ever heard of any lawyer advising a client to say F you to a court order? Because in ordinary circumstances, that will land you in contempt of court and probably in jail. So once this whistleblower statement broke yesterday, something very interesting happened, which is that plaintiffs in the case in front of Judge Boseberg submitted the whistleblower report in support of contempt. And the question that we all have to wait for now is whether or not Judge Boseberg is actually going to hold DOJ attorneys, including potentially the current nominee for the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, in criminal contempt of court. He should, okay? But that's what we're waiting for. So, you know, all of this at this point is, it's just an absolutely mammoth scandal. Because essentially, and you know, we had all suspected this while all of this was going on, that they were intentionally defying court orders. But to have somebody who was in the meetings, who then lost their job for refusing to lie to a judge about what had happened, lost their job for refusing to sign a document. This is all documented, by the way, in the New York Times if you want to go read the article. Sign a document that would have lied to the court about what was going on with the deportations. This is somebody who had a front row view. And I should just say something else about this guy, because already they're calling him like a disgruntled former employee. He won commendations during the first Trump term for enforcing Trump's immigration policies. This is not somebody who is like a democratically appointed DOJ lawyer. This guy was a lifer, 15 years inside the DOJ, had upheld every policy that the Trump people had asked him to uphold in the first term, and he had just been promoted. And yet he did the one thing that I guess is not okay inside Trump's DOJ, which is that he refused to lie to a judge. He refused to violate his oath. And so this situation, I mean, it's just completely beyond the pale. And I had to take some time today to break it down to you all, but it's disgusting. It's amoral. It's wildly unethical. And, you know, it is a confirmation of what we had already suspected, which is that this administration just doesn't give a shit about any court orders that are being put out by any of the district court judges. And also, by the way, one other thing that is contained in these revelations is that they were instructed to essentially obstruct the court's ability to obtain the necessary evidence that would find them in contempt. So all of this stuff that we've seen of like refusing to report to the court on whether or not they were trying to bring Kilmar Abrego Garcia home, refusing to report to the court about what was happening at CCOT, refusing to report to the court about like whether or not an individual had been wrongfully deported, all of that is intentional. It's not an accident. It's not like DOJ lawyers are now, what I had suspected was they were being carved out of conversations where, you know, things were happening at DHS and DHS had made a determination under Kristi Noem that they just weren't going to tell the DOJ. No, it's way worse than that. They knew what was happening and they intentionally obstructed and lied and withheld it from judges. And it's obscene. Just like absolutely obscene. So, all right. So that's that kind of big breaking news today. And you should, of course, call your senators and tell them not to vote for Emil Bove to have a lifetime appointment to the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. It's terrible. Okay. Somebody asked me to talk about posse comitatus. So in the case before Judge Breyer, Judge Charles Breyer, brother of now retired Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, got back the case from the Supreme Court concerning the mobilization of the National Guard. And you will remember that the Supreme Court said, you can mobilize the National Guard for now while the rest of the case proceeds, okay? And that determination, by the way, was a determination on whether or not the means by which the National Guard had been called up without consulting the governor was legal. But there's another basis that the court had not yet considered, and that is posse comitatus. So what is posse comitatus? The Posse Comitatus Act says that you are not allowed to use the U.S. military for law enforcement against the American people, except in like a very, very limited number of circumstances that aren't relevant. And Judge Breyer had not yet ruled on that issue. And what that means is that that issue was not live in the appeal that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. So yesterday, when Judge Breyer got the case back, he said, well, there's an alternative basis here for me to consider as to whether or not the mobilization of the California National Guard was legal, and that is posse comitatus. And so that proceeding that's where we are now in front of Judge Breyer. And what I will say about this is that it is very clear to me that Judge Breyer feels very strongly that the mobilization of the California National Guard was not lawful, not just for reasons that have already reached the Supreme Court, but for other reasons as well. And that's good. You know, this, by the way, falls into something that we were talking about yesterday, which is that there's new stats out that show that in 94% of the cases, the district court judges have ruled against the Trump administration. 94% have found that the Trump administration was acting in violation of law. The Supreme Court, on the flip side, has ruled in favor of the Trump administration 94% of the time in the cases that have reached it so far. The problem with all of this, of course, is that essentially we now have a judiciary that is at war with itself, where the Supreme Court and the district court judges are operating on two totally different interpretations of law. And the question that we have now, which seems to be popping up, it has popped up already this week. Judge Breyer is not the first judge where this has been an issue. Seems to be that district court judges are not interested in following Supreme Court precedent now if they have a way around it and they know what the Trump administration is doing is illegal. It's becoming very clear that a lot of these district court judges understand that the Supreme Court is politicized. Now, what does that mean in the context of like where our democracy is headed? It's kind of anybody's guess. But the fact that Judge Breyer is still trying to find a way to demobilize the California National Guard, notwithstanding what the Supreme Court did, is a sign of where we're at. And he's trying to do it using posse comitatus, and we'll see where that falls. Okay. Speaking of the Supreme Court, we had a very bad decision out of the Supreme Court this morning that we need to talk about. This is a case involving Planned Parenthood in South Carolina. And so here's the lay of the land on this. Medicaid, when Medicaid money is allocated to the states, it is allocated with certain conditions. And what essentially those conditions say that Medicaid recipients get to choose any qualified provider of choice to get the services that they are seeking using Medicaid. Okay. South Carolina ruled in its administration of the Medicaid funds that it had gotten from the federal government that it was not going to allocate any money to Planned Parenthood, not just for abortion services, but for anything, okay? And we all know that a lot of people use Planned Parenthood for contraception and basic medical care and prenatal care and all sorts of other things, all right? And so 2 Medicaid recipients, actually it's one individual and one group, sued the state of South Carolina, claiming that the state of South Carolina was in violation of the terms of Medicaid because it was denying them their mandated requirement to be able to use the provider of choice for the Medicaid-based services that they were seeking. Today, the Supreme Court ruled that those individuals, and really any individuals, do not have standing to sue a state when they cut Medicaid off from a given organization. So it's not a ruling that South Carolina didn't violate the Medicaid statute. This is called threading a needle. Instead, it's a determination that there simply isn't a right to sue. And somebody asked me on the Patreon feed this morning, does this mean that this applies for like all of Medicaid? Well, not likely, maybe, okay? And I'm going to explain how this works. Ordinarily, a case, when the Supreme Court rules or any court rules, it's on the basis of the case in front of them, right? This case involves allocated funds to Planned Parenthood that South Carolina said couldn't be allocated to Planned Parenthood, and therefore the Medicaid recipients were denied their practitioners of choice for contraception. Those people cannot sue the state of North Carolina over this. Does this case mean that, say, if a state says we're not allocating any Medicaid money to anybody administering childhood vaccines, that an individual could not sue that state? Probably there is an argument to be made that the answer to that would be yes. But because this case only concerns this particular circumstance, it would be an argument that would say this is persuasive authority from the Supreme Court, who has already ruled in a related case that individuals did not have a right to sue on this basis. The thing that's troubling about it is that it does seem to be empowering states to deny, because the basis in South Carolina was we're not giving money to Planned Parenthood because they use funds for abortions, and that's, like the end of a life. There's like some very nasty pro-life language in there. The thing that that is the issue here, and actually I've misspoken because somebody's saying, so who would have standing? It's not really about standing. It's about the right to sue. Do you have a right to sue under the law? That's really what the issue is. So it's not the traditional doctrine of standing, which we've talked about a bit here. It's actually like whether or not they have a basic right to sue. And so the argument is going to be down the road that if a state decides to cut off something for moral reasons to a certain provider, the individual who wants that provider does not have a right to sue. That's the argument that will be made. How far this goes, slippery slopes and all that is anybody's guess. But again, I'm going to point out 6-3 decision. You all know what the split is. And again, it's a rollback of the fundamental access to medical care under Medicaid that has now essentially given the states a basis to deny funding to practitioners who are acting in ways that they don't like without any remedy being available. Okay. So very troubling and disturbing case, like yet another incursion into medical care access. I mean, for Christ's sake, we just need socialized medicine. That's like all it comes down to. Okay. Iran. So this morning, Pete Hegseth. Okay. So let's back up for a second. Trump is very, 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 very mad about the fact that the mainstream media has been reporting on the fact that the bombing of Iran was not successful. That, in fact, the New York Times and others have confirmed that there's internal intelligence reporting that shows that this particular bombing only set Iran's trajectory to potentially building a nuclear weapon back about 6 months. They didn't destroy the facilities entirely. And also that Iran, because Trump is a moron and has been out there tweeting about the intent to invade Iran and bomb Iran, moved all of the material that they had anyway to other sites. Trump is really, 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 really mad that those reports are public, that the mainstream media, CNN, New York Times, MSNBC have all been reporting the truth. And while at the NATO summit completely lost it, as we talked about yesterday, 3:30 a.m. European time was tweeting about how, all of it was fake and this was demeaning the soldiers who had flown the bombers. How? No. Also, statements have been made in the last 24 hours that this was Hegseth said this, the most secret military operation in history, to which I'm like, what about D-Day and the invasion of Normandy? Okay, fine. So Trump forced Pete Hegseth to give a press conference this morning at 8 a.m. about all of this. I predicted last night, and I wasn't wrong about this, that this was going to be a repeat of Sean Spicer's press conference right after the inauguration, where essentially he screamed at the press about the size of crowd sizes and accused the press of making all sorts of shit up. And it was just so obvious where this was going, because clearly Trump sees this as a blow to his narcissistic supply, and he's sending his lackeys out to attack those who have simply told the truth about the lack of success of this particular bombing campaign. All right. Hegseth this morning, it could have been like a mirror image of what Sean Spicer did in 2017. Literally exact same tone of voice, exact same frame up with regard to what the press was doing. Hegseth stood there and shouted that, all the mainstream press was lined up against President Trump. And because you all get such joy out of attacking President Trump, of course you're going to lie and say that the bombing campaign wasn't successful, because you have to lie. You have to say he's a terrible guy in order to get your ratings. Just garbage, just straight garbage. And, then did this whole thing about these fighter pilots had to fly 36 hours. Do you know how hard that is? That has literally nothing to do with whether or not the mission that they were assigned to accomplish was successful. And by the way, please don't mistake me. All bombing is bad. We shouldn't have bombed Iran in the first place. But the problem now is that we have a cover-up of a bombing that was not justified, that wasn't based on intelligence, with claims that there was total obliteration of Iran's nuclear capacity, which is now false. And simultaneously, there's allegedly a ceasefire that nobody's kind of really exactly sticking to, or at least, didn't stick to in the beginning. I don't know where we are today. And, from that perspective, is now a burgeoning scandal in foreign policy for the United States. So, I think Trump got his fifis hurt and doesn't like it. And now we have, the Secretary of Defense out screaming at the press, of which he used to be one, I'll point out, 6 months ago, solely for the sake of propping up Trump's incredibly fragile, narcissistic ego. So it's not pleasant at all. And, I do want to remind everybody that none of this is surprising in the context, because we know this. I went last night and watched the Sean Spicer press conference from 2017 because I was just curious. Of course, we all remember Melissa McCarthy from Saturday Night Live playing Sean Spicer, but I went back and actually watched the press conference. And it's amazing how many times this has now happened, hundreds of times, where some Trump official or cabinet member or lackey in the Congress or in the Senate goes out and says, President Trump is the greatest leader of all time, and the American public love him, and you people are the reason why, leaks and, nonsense and lying. Sean Spicer was talking about carpets being laid on the mall that misrepresented the number of people who had been at the first inaugural. It's just, you go back and you look at this and you're like, how could anyone have been so stupid as to allow this to happen again? But here we are. So that's where things stand today on that front. And who knows where they're going to stand tomorrow. But in the meantime, I want to just touch on one thing related to yesterday's broadcast, when we were all extremely overjoyed about Zohran Mamdani winning the Democratic nominee for mayor in New York City. I just want everybody, and I know we're like early in this, but I get asked a lot of questions about the Patreon feed about where we are heading into 2026. It is really important right now that we study what went well in that campaign. And there was reporting, I want to say like maybe 3 weeks out from the primary election in New York City about what Mamdani's ground game looked like and how they had mobilized people and what that game plan had been. The ground game for this campaign was flawless. So was his social media strategy. We talked yesterday about how his messaging was very simple and memorable and really well constructed. So something that I just want people to think about, because, we have people from all over the country and honestly all over the world who watch here, but there are very significant lessons to be learned from this campaign. Morris Mitchell, also founder of Working Families Party, who, of course, sponsored Mamdani's run. He was one of their chosen candidates. I vote the WFP slate every time these days. I have for like the last 6 years at least. I also put out a couple of videos that are available on Blue Sky and elsewhere about why the campaign worked, right? And a lot of it had to do with focusing on the needs of working people and really getting down to those kitchen table issues of what makes people's lives better, right? And I know that, if you guys missed it, the far right was absolutely losing their minds yesterday about the fact that he had won the nom and will likely be the next mayor of New York City, because he does want to raise taxes on the super rich inside New York. Justifiably so. And he wants to do that so he can make buses free for everybody, so that there can be free food supermarkets for people who need it, right? That are run by the city, so that, the needs of working and poor New Yorkers are met, so that there is a capacity to fight ICE and their invasions into New York City when he is the mayor. And we're not talking about huge, New York's taxes are high, don't get me wrong, but we're not talking about huge tax hikes here on these super rich, right? But you would have thought that, these folks were about to be lined up and shot by firing squad from the way in which Wall Street denizens, super rich people in Manhattan, were responding to the potential of his election. And, I said it yesterday, I'm going to say it again. They're going to throw everything at him. And also we have to watch that too, because the playbook right now is really clear. The way in which we win is by sticking to the needs of everyday people and not controlling the messaging, understanding that people right now who are desperate are not going to fall for the lies and the propaganda of like, oh, he's a terrorist, right? But if you stay drilled down and really focused on the things that matter to people, the cost of housing, the cost of food, the ways in which government can make people's lives easier, right? With platforms that do not throw anybody under the bus. We don't have to throw immigrants under the bus. We definitely are not throwing trans people under the bus. We're not throwing anybody under the bus. And we can still win by doing that, right? So I just want to encourage everybody, baskets for newborns. Exactly. Like you're going to give out a basket to every family that has a baby in New York City so the baby has something to sleep in. This is not hard, right? These are things that actually, like when you talk about them, even on Fox News, people are like, wow, that really actually doesn't sound so bad. So I just want people to take a few minutes, because we're not in the 2026 cycle yet. And, obviously we're going to have lots of conversations about election security and other things the closer that we get to it. But local and state elections are happening like all the time. And honestly, this campaign is a roadmap for how to win anywhere, with the right messaging and the right strategy that makes people's lives better. So I just want to encourage everybody to really stay focused. And yes, he did say that he was raised to be kind to everyone and that every human being matters. And that in and of itself is something that is so contrary to what the Republicans are doing, right? It actually can inspire people to do more for their neighbors. But on top of it, it can make government what it's supposed to be. So all of this is really important. And, I think it's like a case study that all of us should really immerse ourselves in between now and when the 2026 cycle really kicks off in earnest. Okay. Please like this broadcast. Give me a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Drop me a comment if you're watching on the replay. Also, down in the show notes is a link to download our free guide on how you can lead change in your own community without burning out. Really good stuff in there, beautifully designed by my team. Thank you very much. And also, I want to remind everybody that we are here live tomorrow at regular time, and there will be a bonus broadcast tomorrow afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern for our Patreon subscribers only. That's our usual Ask Me Anything format. If you want to join us for that, head on over to patreon.com/resistancelive and become a paid subscriber for as little as $5 a month. And other than that, hang in there. Like, again, I know the news is like fast and furious. Yesterday was a really good day. I told everybody to hang on to the joy as long as possible. Please continue to do that. And in the meantime, I just have to give a big shout out to everybody who's doing really good on the ground work in your own communities to keep people alive, to battle back against ICE and deportations, to make sure that people have access to medical care, that trans and non-binary youth are protected. There's so many vulnerable people right now. And I know a lot of you are out there doing that kind of work, and it's really critical. Nobody may ever know your name. Lots of people do this work without ever being recognized. I just want to recognize you for a moment and say thank you for doing all of it, because it really matters right now. All right, my friends, I will catch you tomorrow at regular time. Lots of love to everyone. Take care of yourselves. Stay grounded. We talked yesterday about mental health, or maybe it was Tuesday. We talk about it every day, but please take care of yourselves. And I will catch you all back here tomorrow at regular time. All right, bye.